for Christmas when I was 2 years old, I told my parents that I wanted a bass. And they said, that's far too big. They don't make basses, for kids your size. And I think I said something along the lines of, oh, that's okay. Santa Claus will find one. When Christmas came around, there was a half-size cello with bass guitar strings under the tree. And so functionally, it was a mini bass.
It is so fun for me to have conversations like the one we're having today with Dan Chmielinski. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations. And one of the pleasures of being in the music world for the length of time I have been is seeing someone like Dan, who I had the chance to work with back when he was in middle school and high school. Seeing someone like Dan move into the professional world where he's playing with people like Wynton Marsalis, the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra, Brian Carter, Jeff Tain Watts, Joey Alexander, so many other people. Dan has a flourishing career as a young jazz artist, a composer, an educator. It's so exciting what he's up to. And not only was Dan one of my private students, like I said, in middle school and high school, by a bizarre turn of circumstances, I ended up being one of his high school orchestra directors for his senior year. So I've known Dan for years and years, and I just can't say enough good things about him. And we dig into so many fun things. We start off with this story that I have recounted many times about his Juilliard audition. Talk about an intense experience and what he's learned in the process for developing his career, advice he'd pass along to other people looking to do something like what he's done, his influences, working with people like Ron Carter, who was his bass teacher the last 2 years of his undergrad at Juilliard. So many great takeaways. Definitely check out Dan's website and follow him on Instagram. And we're going to feature a little bit of music from Dan. So check out the show notes for that. And these podcasts are brought to you by Dario Strings A440 and Upton Bass String Instrument Company. More on them later. But let's dig into this conversation with Dan Chmielinski. I thought it'd be fun, actually, because this is a story I have told many people, and I may very well be getting it wrong, but could we start actually by going back to your Juilliard audition? And can you just tell the story of what that was like all the steps in that? Because I remember that being particularly intense sounding to me.
Intense is an understatement, yeah. No, I mean, I definitely didn't sleep at all the night before, so I was very hopped up on coffee and sleep deprived. But I showed up at around 9 a.m. to check in. And I remember I showed up at the exact same time as the two other undergrad bassists that I was going up against, or at least two of them showed up at the same time. So right off the bat, I met them, and I'd seen their videos and, their Grammy band stuff. So it was just immediately like, okay, it's on. And so I pulled up to the curb and checked in, and then they said, yeah, you have 20 minutes, 30 minutes to warm up, and then you're going to go to this room. And I just remember being super overwhelmed because I'd only been to Juilliard once before then to tour the campus. And so there was kind of like a wow factor just walking through the door and walking up those steps and just being like, okay, this is it. This is serious. And basically the way that Juilliard structures their auditions is it's a callback system. So you have an initial round of Juilliard, Juilliard faculty members, and there are a lot of them, and you don't know quite how many there are until you walk in, which I found out very quickly. So I was warming up and got called to the room, and the door opens, and I walk in, and I just see that there's a house rhythm section, who at the time was Helen Sung and Luca Santianello, who are both super well-respected musicians that I was very familiar with, and that already was kind of setting a tone. And then you turn to your left and you see that there are approximately 15 to 20 faculty members sitting in an L shape in the room, and you're just like, oh wow, that's Kenny Barron, and that's Ray Drummond, and there's Carl Allen, and everybody's of course silent as you walk in. It's just like, oh geez, I was kind of part expecting it to maybe just be the bass faculty, which I actually think is how they do auditions now. I think it's a little less intense, but it definitely sets a tone from the get-go when you walk in and you see all of those people, you know, most of which you've heard their records and you know everything about what they do. And it's just like, okay, here we go. And so that first round was particular. It was just basically playing the repertoire that they had kind of asked me to pre-prepare with the house rhythm section. And honestly, the audition itself is kind of a blur at this point. You know, it was 6 years ago, and it's just like, but it went well. And you know, they were. It was just very matter of fact. You know, it's like, okay, just play this. Thank you. And then you leave and you don't hear anything for several hours, 3 or 4 hours. And then they post a sheet on the list downstairs. And that's basically where it's like, okay, these are the people that we'd like to hear again. So it's a callback situation, which is interesting because that's kind of the traditional structure of a Juilliard audition, I suppose, from drama to dance. And so you don't really get that kind of callback system at most other jazz schools that I auditioned at. But you're called back for an interview, which is where they just talk to you, and it's basically just like, why do you want to be here? What interests you? What are your aspirations in life? And these are you're not meeting with your teachers at this point. You're meeting with administrative people. So it's just kind of like a good way for them to get to know why you're interested in the school. And it was great to talk to them. And so once you get past that, there's a little theory test that you have to take. And then the final round, which is much later in the evening. So timeline-wise, you're getting there basically around 9 in the morning. You know, your first round is like at 10. The interview's at, say, 1 p.m. You know, you got to take the theory test at 2:30. And then the final round is until like 4:30 p.m. because they do like to squeeze in a lot of different instruments on the same day. And so it was like 4:35 p.m. and they were like, okay, you're coming back for your final round. And this was all ear training stuff. And it was wild. It was basically, you know, it started out how you might think it would start, you know, just having someone play chords and identifying the chords, playing dominants with alterations, and you had to identify what the upper structures were, just stuff like that. But then it was the hardest part of it was they had you play along with the rhythm section, and they said, we're going to play rhythm changes. We're not going to tell you what key it's in. And, oh, yeah, the pianist is going to change keys every chorus, and you have to follow her. I was like, okay. And you know, I just remember the intro to the rhythm changes that they played for me was literally just the pianist just like hitting random notes, and then it started, and I was like, oh, okay, we're in D. Cool. All right, cool. And then I like was hanging on. You know, it's just like, it's crazy. And, you know, it's not a slow tempo either. And so it's kind of just like, can you hang? Which is, you know, it's actually kind of a good practical test because it's like, you know, I've had to do that in many real life scenarios where I don't know a song, or I do know a song, but it's with a singer and it's in a different key that she said it was going to be in. And, you know, so it was actually kind of a good practical test. But, you know, you're basically there from 9 a.m. till like 7 p.m. and then you don't find out for, you know, a month or so. But definitely very, very intimidating. Yeah,
that is the story that I've related to many people talking about music school. And it's like, well, look, it can be very intense. Let me tell you this story about a former student, Dan, and so maybe just along the lines of like that skill set, like being able to hang and to be able to, you know, hear basically random notes, and then boom, you're in the key, and then there's signaling to go into the different chorus. So how the heck do you develop a skill set like that? Maybe we can zoom back and just. You started playing, I think you're the youngest starting bass player I've ever worked with, at least. You started at 3?
I started at 3, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a natural question that someone would be listening to is like, this would be like, how is it that a 3-year-old would express desire to play a bass, and how did that, because it's kind of a different world now in terms of little basses, but even so, 3 is young. Just tell the story of how you ended up playing bass at age 3.
Yeah, well, it actually started when I was 2. You know, my parents are not musicians, but they're music enthusiasts. And so I grew up around all kinds of different styles of music. You know, we'd be on long car rides and my dad would play everything from jazz to 80s pop to, you know, folk music, bluegrass. Like, I mean, I heard just about everything. And I must have picked up on the fact that the bass was in everything, you know, because I always gravitated towards the sounds of the bass. And anytime there'd be a bass on TV, you know, when we watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and King Friday the 13th would play his bass, I would always light up. and I don't remember this, but I'm just relaying from what my parents told me. My dad bought a piece of computer software called Microsoft Instruments, which was basically a very early kind of music software where you could go through the orchestra and play clips of every instrument. And I always gravitated towards the sound of the bass. That was really the thing that I wanted. And so for Christmas, when I was 2 years old, I told my parents that I wanted a bass, and they said, that's far too big. They don't make basses, for kids your size. And I think I said something along the lines of, "Oh, that's okay. Santa Claus will find one." And so, basically when Christmas came around, there was a half-size cello with bass guitar strings under the tree. And that kind of worked, and it did the trick. And so functionally, it was a mini bass. But yeah, it was a weird combination of things. I think I grew up around music and always really loved the sound of the bass. That's what I fell in love with first, was just the tone of it and the look of it. It was love at first sight, for sure.
And you've had this association with the Richard Davis Young Bassist Foundation, and I know that started early. This year you're going to be there teaching, and it's the 25th anniversary. What is the anniversary?
25th anniversary. Yeah,
okay.
25th anniversary, and I'm back for my second year of teaching as a faculty member, which is such a privilege to be able to do after all these years. I went from literally age 3 until 18, so I was there for 15 years straight. And I will tell you one thing: if there is any way to inspire a young bassist, it is putting them around 80 other bassists, because that's what I saw when I first showed up. Was, wow, there's just it's basically, I would equate it to kind of, the ISB conferences kind of modeled what they do after Richard Davis, if I understand the story correctly. Mm-hmm. But it's along the lines of that, which is just, tons of basses. Tons of bassists getting there and doing all kinds of performances, and there's clinics and ensembles, and it's just such a joyous experience. And there was nothing better to kind of spool up my love for music and my love for the bass than that conference. And so I owe a great deal to Richard Davis and the way that conference is run, and all the faculty members, to getting me to where I am today, because, that was really it. And honestly, that was one of my very first exposures to jazz, was watching bassists like Rufus Reed and John Clayton, Christian McBride, and Richard himself play. My mom likes to say that at an early age, I used to say jazz is my style, which, it took me a while, and then it's pretty funny to think about that now. But this is the 25th year, and they're bringing back some great clinicians. Christian McBride will be there. And yeah, it's kind of a big deal. There's going to be a big concert. And if you know a young bassist in your life, or are a young bassist and want to experience something that'll really kind of take you to the next level, this is a great thing to apply for and register with. So I definitely, Richard Davis Bass Conference.
So age 3.
Yeah.
And I think you played on stage at age 3, even, at that young age. Who were you studying with? Did you start with Virginia Dixon at that young age?
I did. So as chance should have it, a family member saw an article about Virginia Dixon in a newspaper, how she taught young bassists. Not quite that young, but she was featured as basically a teacher that specialized in teaching young students. And my parents got in touch, and she was one of the only teachers that didn't laugh at them when they said, I have a 3-year-old bassist. So I learned so much from her and studied with her for many years. But she was my very first teacher. But as I said, I basically, the very first thing she told me to do was go to the Richard Davis Bass Conference. That was literally step 1. It's like, you're going to this. And, they were all super excited, and, I just, that was such an important thing. And she was like, this is where you're going. It's like, okay. And, so right off the bat, I was just surrounded by sources of inspiration, and really just had such a solid foundation, for learning and loving the instrument.
What a great, set of influences of Richard Davis and Rufus Reed and John Clayton and all those other people that have been associated with that. Did you and jazz quickly became your style, I guess, as you said. Did you ever picture yourself doing anything else, or did you always know jazz bass is what you wanted to do? Like if you go back in time to 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 12-year-old, whatever age, Dan, has this been like because I know you have many other interests and many other skills. Was that path always clear for you?
Yeah, I mean, there was never really a doubt that the bass was going to be a part of my life forever. I mean, it just always felt right. It's what I grew up doing. Even before I knew that you could do music as a viable profession, I knew it was going to be kind of my thing, and it was going to be the thing that I expressed myself through regardless. And so it was just kind of a natural progression, I would say. Just the more people that I met that were professional musicians and professional bassists, just kind of fueled my love and passion for it. And it's only now, as I've gotten older, that I've kind of started to branch into other things, movie scoring, production, composition. Those are things I can honestly say that I wasn't fully, I didn't see that in the future as much as I did when I got to college and kind of started meeting a lot of people in New York City, and seeing the possibilities there. But the bass has always been the thing, and it's always been the steady, so I can't really remember a time in my life when I didn't know that was the thing I wanted to do. Yeah. And
you did another like pre-Juilliard thing that I'm sure had a big impact in addition to Richard Davis. You did the Staines Institute at Ravinia after your junior year. Is that when that was? Or
junior year? I think it was either, I know, because I knew I was going to Juilliard when I went there. So I think it was actually after my senior year of high school, going into my freshman year of college. The Staines Institute was run by David Baker at the time, and Curtis Fuller, Nathan Davis, and Rufus Reed. And that definitely was an incredible primer to New York City, because all of the musicians, well, not all of them, but I would say a third of them were already New York based, had New York success, and were like, oh, you're coming? That's great, And so it's such a warm family environment there as well. And you get to basically spend a week at Ravinia studying with these jazz masters, talking about composition, workshopping stuff. I tell people this now, I think it was maybe just a step above where I was in my development. And so it really kind of pushed me into the next level, where I was wanting to go. And that is really where I first was like, oh, composition, this is the thing. This is really cool to be able to write pieces for ensembles and groups of different instrumentation. And everybody there is just so down to try stuff, and basically every ensemble is like, oh, let's just workshop these songs for days on end. And it's a great thing if you get the opportunity to do it.
This episode is brought to you by Dario Strings. Check out their Kaplan strings, which have versatility and control throughout the entire dynamic spectrum. Rich tonal color palette, superb bow response, and beautiful balance. I've been using them myself on my bass for the last year or so and totally love them. They sound great pizzicato. They sound great arco. Folks like David Allen Moore of the Los Angeles Philharmonic use them. Brandino of Black Eyed Peas, he uses them. What fantastic strings. Thank you for sponsoring the podcast, Dario. This episode is brought to you by the A440 Violin Shop. It's located just down the street from Wrigley Field in beautiful Chicago on the north side, just off the Brown Line. I have been going there my entire adult life, and they have been fantastic, both for repairs. I've had cracks repaired. I've had seams glued. I've had all sorts of students go to A440 to get instruments, to get bows. They're available with a smile, do wonderful work, and definitely check them out if you are in the Midwest. A440violinshop.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast. When you got to Juilliard, that was a relatively new program, right? The jazz major in the first few years, wasn't it?
Well, I would say I think the year that it started was 2001. Okay. So I was coming in 2012. So I had just missed the 10-year kind of anniversary. But it's a program that's seen a lot of development, a lot of change, a series of different administrative faculty members, program directors. And so I feel like I got a very good variety of that when I was there, because when I started, it was led by Carl Allen. In the middle, there was Frank Kimbrough was the director, and then most recently it's been Wynton Marsalis under artistic director Aaron Flagg. And so it's been three very different vibes for me, because I did my 4-year undergrad and then I did a 1-year accelerated master program. So I feel like I kind of got the spectrum. The only thing I didn't really get to see was Victor Goines, who was the original director.
And who you also worked with at Midwest Young Artists, at least in some capacity, right? Back in Chicago.
Yeah, Victor came for a weekend. He was like the featured Jazz in January guest. Victor I've known since then and have seen at Jazz Lincoln Center performances all over New York and Chicago. So I did get to work with him and know him well. Yeah.
So take me behind the scenes of maybe the Juilliard jazz undergrad experience, and then maybe a little bit about the master's program. Like, what, to someone who, people know you're studying jazz, but like, what was the day-to-day like? What were some of the highlights, some of the, tell us about that.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. The most incredible thing about Juilliard for me was just being in the hallways with all of the other students, because the jazz program is relatively small. There's only 35 students at the time that I was there. I think there's a little more now, but really not all that much when you take into consideration that that's 4 years of undergrad, 2 years of master's, and then you have the artist diploma students, which is a program that's it's kind of, you get a certificate. It's not a degree program, but it's an all expenses paid, full scholarship thing, where basically you just come and do rehearsals, and the idea is to have like the best working band. And so they're there, and so what you realize is when you walk into Juilliard and you see all these students, 75% of them are not doing what you're doing. There's dance students, there's actors, there's classical musicians, and it's really, really incredible to be in the halls with people that are your age, that are as passionate, if not more passionate, about what they do, but what they do is completely different from you. So I would almost say the best thing about Juilliard's jazz program is not so much the jazz part about it. It's just being at Juilliard among the student body. It's really inspirational, and I ended up doing tons of things with, collaborations with other majors that I never expected I would ever do. But day to day in terms of jazz, you have your private teacher that you take your lessons with once a week. If you're a rhythm section player, there's a rhythm section dedicated class where you get to work with Kenny Washington, who's one of the greatest jazz drummers of all time. Workshop repertoire with all of the rhythm section players. There's a great improvisation class taught by Ron Blake and Mark Carey, where you just kind of really get to, it's a great way to spend a Tuesday early morning. It's just kind of, being free and working on all kinds of stuff. And Mark is really great because he has just a diverse background in terms of his influences. He's really into kind of, Indian music, raga, that kind of stuff. And so you get all kinds of different harmonic possibilities from him. And then, there's ensembles. Everybody's put into an ensemble. So you get to work with a different ensemble every year, which is led by a faculty member. And my faculty members, I had Xavier Davis 1 year. I had Elio Villafranca 1 year, Matt Jodrell for 2 years. And so you get to kind of workshop pieces under a themed concert that happens maybe every 2 to 3 months. And so you get to really kind of explore stuff that you might not explore otherwise. Like we did the music of Ornette Coleman once then, but then, the next concert was the music of Jelly Roll Morton. And so, it's very, very diverse in terms of the styles of music that you get to play. And then on Fridays, you get to have this class called Creative Ideas, which is basically where they bring in people from outside of Juilliard to kind of talk about whatever their field is, their specialty. I think that's pretty much it. And then there's big band, of course. If you are in the big round rotation, you'll have that in place of the rhythm section class. So it's in your first year, you take theory classes, piano classes, introduction to piano, ear training. And then in your later years, you'll take courses like jazz history with people like Phil Schaap, Lauren Schoenberg, and Kenny Washington.
Well, I love the idea of that creative ideas class, that Friday class. What do you remember? Any people that came in? Any highlights? That's
sure.
Fascinating addition to the degree. Yeah,
definitely. It was a very different class when I first started from when I was graduating. So when I first started, it was called Friday Forum, and that was kind of it was basically every week there'd be a guest artist that would come in and talk for, an hour, 2 hours, answer questions, play with the students. And so, in my first couple of years, we had some really notable guests. Cedar Walton came and spoke, and he passed away shortly after that. And so that was really a tremendous experience to be able to be around him and hear what he had to say. Who else was there? George Coleman, the amazing tenor saxophonist, came in, who was, on Miles Davis, played in Miles Davis's quintet briefly between the first and second quintet. And then who else? There was a ton of people. Maria Schneider came in, talked about big band writing. But in my later years, the class kind of became more of an open discussion. So it became more surrounded on discussing topics that we wanted to talk about within jazz. So, issues that the modern jazz artist faces today, issues with the music culture today. It got really deep. We would have conversations, and there'd be Wynton Marsalis would also come in and give these talks maybe once a month, and those were always really kind of a culmination of everything that we'd been thinking about and talking about in the class. So he would kind of come in and drop bombs of knowledge, every once a month, and just kind of make everybody think for a second and just be like, this. It was always, for me, the most enjoyable person that came in and talked, because it really kind of stimulated our brains. And he's a guy who, if you know him at all, never accepts complacency as an answer. He wants to hear everybody's voice on everybody's topic. And so those were always really, really interesting talks. I remember the classes went by the quickest when he was there. Yeah.
Well, what a fantastic bunch of influences, just this, obviously all along the way, but these people at Juilliard. And I'd love, so you get there, 18-year-old Dan, right? Freshman year, early. And then you've had quite a career unfold, over the last few years. Can you maybe just take us through what happened outside of school, or maybe just how, because you get there and I'm assuming you have no gigs, right? Yeah. That's what typically happens. And then you've anybody who follows Dan, and everybody should follow Dan on his Instagram, by the way, but you can see, all the traveling is done all over the world. I think for a long time it was like, where's my bass taking me today? You had something like that. And,
Still going.
Yeah. So just take us through the progression and maybe how this career you built yourself has unfolded.
Sure. Well, still building. That's the short answer. This is New York City, and it is one of the most competitive places on the planet, especially if you want to do jazz. And there are just so many good musicians here that really, when you first arrive, it can be very overwhelming. And it was for me, for sure. I had classmates, other bassists, that were working a lot more than me and had kind of already laid the groundwork for coming to New York City and had visited here before and knew people here before. And so it's really easy to get discouraged at first, because you look around and you just go, man, everybody has work except me, and I just felt like this homebody that was kind of like at Juilliard all the time, working on my studies, just trying to get good grades. Meanwhile, there's this whole other world that's happening outside of the Juilliard bubble, as we say, because Juilliard is a lot of work. It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of dedication. And so you can spend all of your time working on Juilliard coursework, and you can spend all of your time practicing, and you can spend all of your time writing. But there is this tremendous feeling that, like, it's almost like a fear of missing out thing, where it's just like, there's this whole rich tradition of New York jazz. And so it's like, well, maybe I should be doing that. And there is truth and value to both mentalities. I'm glad that I really spent the majority of my first couple of years focusing on my studies, because I learned a tremendous amount about the instrument, gained the respect of my teachers, and really felt like I made so much substantial progress on my playing, my improvising, just my feeling for the music in those years. But there is nothing that really beats real world experience. And so in New York, there's kind of a mentality that if you go to jam sessions and you stay out till 2, 3 in the morning and you meet and you network, that can lead to gigs. And so I kind of subscribed to that theory as I got into my sophomore year, junior year. I was hanging out and trying to meet as many people as I could. And basically my theory was, hey, I'm living in the dorms at this point. I'm a student. I'm just trying to work wherever I can. I really didn't care how much gigs paid. I didn't care what the gigs were. I didn't care what the repertoire was. It's just like, I'm Dan. I have a bass. I want to bring my voice to whatever you're doing. And so for a while there, I was taking just, a lot of little gigs just around the city, just trying to get my name out there. And so, when I started kind of going out and meeting people, it's amazing how quickly you can pick up traction as a musician, because, it's incredible the people that you run into. If you go to Small's Jazz Club at 3 a.m., there is a 75% chance that Roy Hargrove will be there. There are just people that are on the scene, hanging out for the love of the music. And so when you show that same love, it's kind of a reciprocal thing where you get to talk to people and networking. And it's so funny because, other people, friends that I have from home that have more traditional jobs, talk about how they network and talk about how, they have their LinkedIn profiles and everything. And for me, my networking was going to clubs and meeting people at 2, 3 in the morning who had gigs. And so ultimately, I was taking a lot of little gigs around the city, and then I started to become a little more tactful. I was trying to see which musicians in the playing styles of music that I really liked and people that I really wanted to play with. And I just started showing up and kind of making it known to those people that I wanted to play with them. And, as a young musician in New York, you have the advantage of everybody kind of wants the next best thing. They want the freshest guy off the boat, per se, And so if I would say my advice would be just if you show up and you really kind of pinpoint exactly what you want to be doing, that will typically be your guiding compass in terms of where you end up. And for me, it was. I was taking gigs with a great band leader by the name of Sammy Miller, who now is touring, almost 365 days a year and is on the road with his own group. But at the time, he had an earlier iteration of it, which was a big band. And we would play these dance parties at Dizzy's Club Coca-Cola, which still happen. I just played it a couple nights ago. But he would play these dance parties, and it would just be really great, feel-good music for people to come dance to. And that is where I was heard. That's actually how I got the gig with Joey Alexander. Was a mutual family friend of Joey's was there that night and heard me playing with the big band and said, I think this would be a really good match. Joey, who, if you don't know, he was coming from Indonesia and needed a fundraiser to kind of get his visa paperwork together. And so there was this fundraiser event, and it was, it was basically a house party thrown by this person who had heard me and was like, you should come and play with Joey and hear this incredible kid. And, I showed up and I didn't really know what to expect. I'd seen the videos on YouTube, but I didn't really know the full extent of what he was capable of. And basically, one thing that led to another, and played that night. And then about 6 months later, they started calling me regularly. And that led to, 3 years of gigging and performing all around the world. And so, you kind of build, you take steps on the next thing, right? So when people started hearing I was performing with Joey, they were like, oh, well, maybe we should take a look at this, you kind of just establish rapport, I guess is the best way to put it. And so I think it's a lot of little steps to get to bigger steps, and then you kind of work your way up. And then once you're established as a sideman, you can take on things as a leader. And you can have your own groups, and then clubs will take you seriously. And so it really is kind of a slow burn process in terms of just kind of getting to the next level and moving up and building on what you've already accomplished.
Mm-hmm. So jam sessions that's a thing that works.
Works. Everybody has a different path. That's the other side of this, right? I have a friend who I'll leave his name out, but doesn't really subscribe to that theory at all, and has never really hung and done the late night hangs at Smalls and all that stuff. And he's doing quite well for himself, so it really goes to show you that there's no one path to where you want to be. My general impression has been, if you have a very solid picture of what you want to be doing, and you have a very solid vision of where you want to be in life, it is a lot easier to figure out the little steps that it takes to get there. And for some people, that is networking at late hours of the night, going to jam sessions, trying to be heard. That's a little free for all for me. I didn't really I did it, but I didn't do it to the extent of a lot of other young jazz musicians. I really kind of prefer a more tactful approach. I think that's a very valid thing too, is looking at the people that are working on the scene today and saying, okay, who do I want to play with? Where can I see my sound in their band? And approaching those people and talking to those people and showing interest and, always being genuine. You never want to just kind of suck up to people, because that shows, as I've seen that backfire on a lot of people. But, you definitely want to have a solid idea of where you want to be, and then that will kind of give you it's like a work in reverse thing. It's like, if you know where you're going, that'll help you figure out how to get there.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's great advice. And that just being genuine, that's a thing that musicians, well, anybody can struggle with, but musicians, particularly people who sit in rooms for long periods of time, polishing these little details, sometimes those social graces are kind of lost.
Absolutely. And that is the one thing that, shines above all else is being genuine and being really an honest person and honestly wanting to be there for the right reasons. All that stuff is important. And it is really, there's a pressure here because, there are certain shortcuts that you can see that are quote unquote disingenuous, that would maybe get you to somewhere that you want to be. But I found that kind of putting in the time and really, establishing connections, meaningful connections with people is really the best way to form relationships, get the gigs that you want, and just kind of start building your portfolio.
One thing that has impressed me about Upton Bass ever since I got to know them was how many artists there are out there that are so satisfied with the work that Upton has done for them. Here's Mark Ramirez on his experiences having Upton copy his beautiful Cavani bass.
I do a lot of moving around and giving master classes and stuff like this. I had a copy made of it by the Uptons, by Gary and Eric Roy at the Upton shop. They made a copy of it, but they made an even smaller copy. I think it's a 7/8 copy of the bass. I use it now. I use that bass for my solo playing, which I do a lot. Recently, I've been doing a lot, especially here. And it has a detachable neck. The detachable neck, man, I tell you, in Europe, it's the craze.
Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast, guys. Ron Carter.
Yeah, there's that.
Who you've worked with. So was Ron your primary teacher while you were at Juilliard, or one of the teachers? How did that all work? And then what was Ron like as a teacher?
Ron, yeah. So when I started at Juilliard, my first 2 years I studied under Ben Wolf, who's an incredible bassist. If you're not familiar with his work, check him out. He taught me more about bass lines and general feel and time, than I ever, really just kind of broadened my horizons in those fields. And then my last 2 years of undergrad, I studied with Ron Carter. And that was always kind of the end goal for me. I definitely came to Juilliard knowing that he was on faculty, and I was like, okay, I definitely want to study with him. But he doesn't take that many students. And so I knew that it would be kind of a long shot to not have him for my first 2 years as a freshman. But he would come and teach studio classes when I was a freshman. So I was working with him and exposed to him for my first 2 years at Juilliard, and then I got to work with him one-on-one every week. My last 2 years, yeah. So Ron Carter, what do you want to know?
What's a Ron Carter lesson like?
Ron Carter lesson. Well, he is definitely a guy that values taking everything seriously, and everything I was saying about being genuine and putting in the time, that lines up with his mantra pretty solidly. You know, he wants you to put in a ton of time on all kinds of exercises, and he starts you very basic. Like, you start with the Slama book 1, you know, that kind of thing. Like it's very. What I tell people is, you know, a lot of bass teachers try and take giant concepts and start to kind of work in what the student already knows. Ron is not like that. Ron cuts you down and then builds you back up, right? So you start at book 1, Samandal, you know, like that kind of stuff with him. But the approach that you take to it is it's on a micro level. Like he's very scrutinizing on everything that you're doing, and he will have you play something over and over and really just focus on things that were in my rear view mirror at this point. You know, just basic posture with the instrument. Is my bass set at the right height? Can I tune my bass? You know, what does my left hand look like? And, you know, when you go to his house, there's just a giant mirror that you play in the corner, and he sits over here. And so you're basically looking at yourself and checking out every little movement that you're making. And he just makes you focus on the instrument in a way that I hadn't focused on my instrument in a long time. Because, you know, as bassists, we always are trying to kind of up our game and get to the next thing. And we don't realize that sometimes the gremlins that are causing our issues are so more remedial than we're making them out to be. And the Ron Carter work ethic lesson mentality kind of teaches you to take a step back. So in terms of jazz, you know, we start with F major scale. Like, that's literally the very first thing that he has you play. He's like, you know, nice to see you. You know, he gives you a second to tune up. He comes back. You play on his bass, by the way. You can bring your own if you want, but I would much rather play on Ron Carter's bass. No knock against my own, but there were a few times in there that he actually he would always let me play his current bass, but there were a few times in there when he would actually let me play the bass that he used with Miles in the 60s, and, you know, all kinds of fun stories. Like, he'd show me dings on the bass and be, you know, cymbal fell on the bass there, you know, so, you know, Herbie kicked to the bass there, something like that. But anyway, you know, you walk in and he wants to hear an F major scale in perfect time and with even notes and focusing on intonation. And, you know, there is something about the way that he listens to his students. You know, it's incredible. I've never been in a teacher-student setting where I've felt like my ears were his ears. You know, every time I would hear something that I didn't really dig, or I knew I was not doing my best, he would say it almost immediately after. And so he was kind of a mind reader in that way, where you know, I was kind of self-teaching myself, and I was like, okay, yeah, that wasn't so great. And then he'd stop, you know, Mr. Chmielinski, you know, I was out of tune. You know, and it was funny. I mean, it was funny, but it was also very, like, reassuring, because that mentality is something that we as musicians and bassists can kind of forego in the pursuit of bigger things. You know, is kind of just sitting down and being like, okay, yeah, I'm going to play this F major scale for 10 minutes straight, you know, just straight up and down. And I'm going to really focus on the quality of my tone, the evenness of my notes, the intonation, you know, and, you know, he will be the first to stop you if you're not really right on. And as you go on more and more with him, you find that you're stopping yourself before him. Like, my process time was like, you know, initially I would be like, oh, that wasn't so great. And then he would stop me. But towards the end of our lessons, the minute I would not hit a note that I was happy with, I would just stop and say, okay, I'll start, you know, and it is like, it kind of was like teaching me how to teach myself. But, you know, in terms of what I learned the most from him, I would really have to whittle it down to work ethic. You know, and we developed into much more advanced things down the road. But the thing that remained constant was his value that he put into work ethic and time, in terms of how much you're spending on the instrument, and what it really takes to fully master something, even as simple as an F major scale.
And this F major scale or whatever else you might be working on with him, you playing with the bow? You playing pizzicato? Does it vary?
It varies. Mostly it was pizzicato, but he would have us work out of some mandel in ARCA. And so, yeah, no, he definitely, and that's another thing that he values is just having a complete skill set as a bassist, right? And so he would talk about, you know, if someone calls you for a Handel's Messiah gig, which I have been called for in New York, even a jazz bassist, you know, if someone calls you for a Handel's Messiah gig or someone calls you for a Broadway pit show where you have to bow, you have to, you know, be competent in that field and be able to at least know a basic understanding of how to create a tone and how to really kind of be tactful with the bow as well. So, yeah, no, it varied from week to week.
Interesting. And by the way, folks, Dan is a fabulous ARCA player. I know from firsthand experience. So, something that I think about a lot, because I know that people at a pretty high level in the jazz world may have varying levels of ARCA abilities. You came in, I mean, you were like back in Illinois, always doing great in orchestral world as well. How do you think, if at all, just your ARCA facility has contributed to your success? Super. I don't. Maybe it hasn't at all. But have you thought about that at all?
Well, I definitely, I would more so say that than ARCA itself, but just having a classical background has helped me so tremendously in terms of my abilities on the instrument. I mean, the way I started with Virginia Dixon back in the day, you know, all throughout high school was kind of a classical mentality while also doing jazz. And so, setting aside all the repertoire and the benefits from knowing classical repertoire and the benefits of playing in an orchestral section, you do have this really strong technical foundation that jazz teachers don't really emphasize, or a lot of them don't. Obviously, Ron is a different breed, but most jazz lessons that I took really focused on more kind of conceptual, bigger picture things. You know, technique was not ever the focus point. And so that has helped me. And I have heard from people that I respect, that people respect me for my ability to play in tune, to play clear notes, to get around the instrument and to be comfortable with the instrument. And that has to be stuff that I have from my classical background, because, you know, that didn't develop in New York. That's been with me always. And time, you know, I've been holding the instrument since the age of 3. And so, you know, it really has kind of become a part of me in that sense. And so I would say that more so than ARCA, because I don't do a lot of ARCA playing these days. I pull the bow out maybe once a month. Mm-hmm. And it's and a lot of the times it's for the end of a big band chart where I have to hold the note. I do love ARCA playing. I love it. And I still do it for fun, but professionally, I'm not doing it nearly as much as maybe I would have thought I would be doing in high school, you know, because that was something I talked to you about. You know, that was one thing about Juilliard that was kind of like, I don't know if this is the right move, because I was saying, well, I'm going to have to focus pretty much solely on jazz. Only when you get there do you realize that doing both would be impossible in terms of workload. But, definitely not playing as much ARCA as I thought I would. But everything that I learned from my classical days, technique-wise, and just left-hand facility, I use on a daily basis. So, yeah.
And you're doing more and more teaching these days, too. And I know you teach at the Jazz at Lincoln Center, the Young Persons Program, right? Young People's Program. So you do that, and either in that capacity or private teaching in general, like what's a Dan Chmielinski lesson like, or a lesson with Dan like?
Well, I emulate the great teachers that I've had, obviously. I learned a lot from Ron, too, in terms of just where a good starting point is, because I think a lot of educators and a lot of teachers kind of take in students with a very show me what you got kind of approach, which is like, you know, what can you do and where can you start? And that's good and bad, because it's good because you're able to help people through whatever they're working on at that moment. And you're able to help people work on very specific pieces of repertoire, specific ways through a passage. But you're not addressing those bigger issues that I was telling you about. There is a series of checklist things before all of that you really have to make sure that your student has under their fingers. And that's what I'm learning. When I have one-off lessons with people where it'll be just like a single scenario where I'm with someone for a day, that is a scenario where I'll say, like, okay, what are you struggling with? What can I help you with immediately? But if I have a student that's I'm going to see week after week, I will start with, okay, let's make sure that you have these very basic core elements of playing the bass. How are you holding the bass? Does the bass feel natural to you? Making sure your end pin height is at the right height, making sure that your left hand technique is relaxed, but, nothing is collapsing, because that is the quickest way to hand injury, as I have found. And so that's a big thing for me is talking to my students about keeping just a good, relaxed technique in the left hand, working on, how are you creating a sound with the right hand, 2 fingers versus 1 finger, that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, if I'm going to have a more long-term student, you bet I'm coming from Ron Carter. So it's like, we're going to make sure that you have these core things that we can go forward. You may want me to teach you how to play the head to Donna Lee, but I'm going to make sure that you can make a sound with the instrument that is pleasing to both you and me, and I think it kind of is a good way to get students doing self-checks, and really kind of just emphasizing the importance of taking the time to make sure that your relationship with the instrument is as healthy as it can be.
Love it, man. Well, you're a young guy still, and I'm sure we'll have you back on, soon. I should have had you on way before episode 460 or whatever this will be.
All good.
But my sort of traditional last question these days. Let's go back in time a bit. Maybe to Dan starting at Juilliard. If you could give that Dan a bit of advice, what advice might you give that younger Dan?
Boy, that's a loaded question, because it's a lot. I would tell myself a lot. I think that New York City is one of those places where your values and the things that you hold closest to your creative side, everything is called into scrutiny and everything is challenged, be it a challenge from somebody else or a challenge from yourself. There's really, there's not as much work in this city as there used to be in years gone by. And so you're constantly reassessing. Am I doing the right thing? Am I playing the best I can play? Am I doing the right style? Am I appealing to the right people? And you can get really wrapped up in the kind of headspace of self-criticism and trying to find work through self-criticism, which is ultimately a positive result from a negative mentality. And it's just not effective. And one thing that I definitely caught myself doing was comparing myself to other people as a young student at Juilliard. And that is just not the vibe, because you are the only person that's you, and no one else can do what you do as well as you do it. And you can't do what they do as well as they do it, because there is a multitude of performance opportunities in New York City. And ultimately, your personality and what you bring to the music is going to guide you to wherever you end up. And so it's not about the amount you're working. It's not about who you're working with. It's not about the people around you that are doing maybe more or less work, or doing things on the bass in a certain way that doesn't jive with you, but they have more work, or whatever. I would say, if I could talk to myself, be an open book and take in everything, but take it with a grain of salt. Don't take it as gospel. So if one thing is working for someone, that thing's not going to necessarily work for you. But it is good to see that it's working for them and maybe incorporate elements of what they do into what you do. And I ended up doing that, but it took me a lot longer to figure that one out than it should have. And so I would say to myself to just kind of be true to what I know I love about the bass and I love about playing music and playing jazz, and really kind of expand on that rather than harping on every little thing that I'm not doing. Because there's a balance. The Ron Carter mentality is great, but you can apply that mentality in a negative way. You don't want to be too self-critical. It's okay to pat yourself on the back when you have successes. And so if I could talk to myself, that's kind of what I would say in terms of just having a healthy mindset and having faith in the way that I'm doing things being the way that's going to lead me to where I want to be.
thank you, Dan. So great to chat with you for the podcast. It's been a long time coming, and Dan helped me out with some graphics and that sort of thing back in the early days of the podcast. Known him for years, and it's so great to see somebody that you work with when they're young go on and do such cool things like what he's doing. So thanks, Dan. Check him out on his website, danchmielinski.com, and we've got a link to that. And definitely follow him on Instagram. He's quite active there. And where is my bass taking me today? I think that's what he says on his Instagram stories, but it's really fun to see where Dan is headed. And yeah, what a cool career. Hope you enjoyed this conversation. And we do these every week here on the podcast. I have so much fun chatting with people like Dan. And if you are not subscribed to the podcast, it's easy to do. You can just go to contrabassconversations.com/subscribe, and you can subscribe through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher. We're even working on an Amazon Alexa skill. So if you have, is it the Echo? I don't have one of these myself, but you'll be able to even listen to the podcast and pick up where you started off on your Echo. So, whoa, that's cool. In addition to our app for iOS, Android, and Kindle, you can get all of that over at our website, contrabassconversations.com. And you can also reach out and send me a message. I would totally appreciate that. Feedback at contrabassconversations.com. Let me know anything about a recent guest like Dan, or a guest you might like to hear, or a topic, or just say hi. That would be great. I'd love to hear from you. These podcasts are produced by Steve Hinchy, Michael Cooper, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. And if you're looking for a bass, Mitch is making beautiful basses in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Check him out online at mitchmooring.com. I'm your host, Jason Heath, coming to you from San Francisco, California. So glad to be doing these conversations here, and I really hope you enjoyed this. We will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.